Hey, Travis with TechRaptor back at Gen Con 2019, and we are talking with Mark Seifter, one of the leads on Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is a hotly anticipated version of Pathfinder that's been around for a while. Why don't you tell us why this version is awesome?
All right. So with Pathfinder 1st Edition, is an awesome game. I worked in computer science before I was here, and I was a big-time Pathfinder player who just decided to leave my degree and design for Pathfinder. And Pathfinder 1st Edition is like that code that you wrote, and you weren't really necessarily documenting or commenting the code. It just it does everything you want it to do. It has some really cool efficiencies. It has some really cool capabilities. But if anybody except you tries to sort of make an adjustment, 5 things break somewhere else in the code. It's a little hard to get into. And you watching this might have also experienced that Pathfinder 1st is hard to get into. It has enormous depth, some of the most in any role-playing game. With Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we wanted to make a game that kept or improved the depth of Pathfinder 1st Edition while not having that aspect of a huge barrier to entry and being more of a modular design. Just some concepts I learned from computer science that we want to bring in, so that when you learn a rule, we can use that rule across the system. It's a focus on being easier for you to learn, to play, or to GM. Because with tabletop role-playing games, you need someone to GM. You don't have necessarily like a computer to calculate all the math and run all of the monsters in the background. And so by making it easier to learn to play, but keeping or increasing the depth of the game, we hope to make a game that is able to just deliver the kind of rich character customization and stories and the ability to make it your own, make the character your own, while also making it a little bit less hard to join into the game. The way we as game designers like to think about it is that we sort of have a graph with 2 dimensions, where one of them is the barrier to entry, we'll call that the x-axis, and the other is the depth of the game and the customization depth, that's the y-axis. You want that y-axis to be high, you don't want the x-axis to get too high, but normally you have to pay for an increase in depth with added complexity. That's just how a game is. Sometimes you don't. For instance, Go and checkers both probably have about the same amount of barrier to entry of explaining the rules, but Go has a lot more tactical depth than checkers does. And when we wanted to move to 2nd Edition, our optimization goal was to decrease, we wanted to decrease the complexity, the barrier to entry, but we were not going to lower the depth. So we see how low we can get the barrier to entry without sacrificing depth. The way we do that is we take out pieces that maybe were wide on the x-axis but not very tall, that weren't doing much for the depth of the game. We remove those, replace them with tall, thin pieces if we can. So certain depth of choices might be removed for other options to give more depth for less complexity and barrier to entry. So that's going to be one of the key elements of the new game that we're hoping you guys are going to be really excited about, is the modularity and the ability to get into the game really easily.
So one of the things that I've noticed in my time with the book so far is that the action economy is way easier to understand. Can you kind of explain maybe keeping that depth while at the same time making it easier to understand and removing that complexity?
Absolutely. The action economy is one of the things we're really proud about in the new game, because in Pathfinder 1st Edition, it sort of inherited an action economy that came from Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition. And in that action economy, you know, each turn in 1st Edition, you get an action called a standard action and a move action, but you can combine those into a full round action, except if you spend the whole round, there's another kind of action, and you get a swift action. If you haven't used it immediately, there's a lot of actions. Those are all real things in 1st Edition, and I haven't said all of them yet. In the new action economy, we learned from the power and expressive nature of those other specially named actions, but we realized that those names themselves and the weird way that they work, each a little bit different, was a barrier to entry. So the new action economy still lets you build turns that have a variety of different actions, but it's all combined into a few types. You get 3 actions at the start of your turn. Do you want to move, attack something, then move again? that you've taken 3 actions. Sometimes you're going to do something more complex, an activity like casting a spell or a whirlwind attack that hits everybody. That might cost more than one of your actions. It was a big thing. That's how it goes. Also, at the start of each turn, you get 1 reaction. That's something you can do even off your turn, as long as a particular trigger condition has been met. So, for example, Attack of Opportunity has a rich history as a kind of reactive ability in role-playing games. That's when somebody else sort of drops their guard because they're just running past you, or they cast a spell right within your sword length, and you take a swing at them. That's a reaction. You can do that when its trigger has been met. Also, there's some things that just shouldn't cost you your action, like dropping this book on the floor, which I'm not going to do, but I could, and it wouldn't cost me an action. Those are called free actions. Some free actions you can just use on your turn, like an action in order. Others have triggers, which mean that you can use them off of your turn as well, but only when the trigger's met, and it doesn't cost your reaction for the turn. And that's it. I've just not only explained in simple, but even all the way in detail, everything you need to know about building your turns in combat encounters in the game. That's it. Everything else, an individual ability will tell you how many actions it takes, if it takes more than 1. There's an icon in the book to show you that as well, so you can, at a glance, figure out how to build your turns with just exciting and rich tactical combat. You've made your attacks, the monster's still up. Will you risk making a final attack, which is at a penalty for attacking a lot of times, or are you going to raise your shield to raise your defenses? Or move away so your enemy has to spend more of their actions to get up to you? You have to decide what you want to do, because if you do hit with that attack and they're low, you might drop the enemy entirely. If you move away, that's pretty protective for you, but your buddy might get hit because they're still standing next to the monster. If you raise your shield, you might be able to tank that hit. And it's more reliable in that way because you can block with your shield now in Pathfinder 2nd Edition and absorb some damage, but you don't get that risky ability to just completely wipe the monster off the map. So more tactical depth, much simpler execution, and that's exactly a good example.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about the iconography in this version is that you can tell just how long any action will take. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Sure. So if we take a look at this sidebar here, you see that this little black diamond with the little diamond on next to it is a single action. If you have a second diamond stacked on top, that's 2 actions. 3 diamonds, that's all 3 of your actions. The little arrow is a reaction, and this sort of white unfilled diamond is a free action. That means it is free. So that is where we explain it, but if you take a look, say, in Divine Wrath, you can see the 2 stacked diamonds are right there. That means if I want to cast Divine Wrath and just sort of put the smite down on my foes, that's going to take me 2 of my 3 actions for that. I'll still have 1 left over to raise my cleric's shield if I want, move away, or maybe even cast a quick healing spell to make sure that the enemies aren't going to come back and destroy me after I just made them face Divine Wrath. We built the introduction very, very specifically. Oh, and here's a really nice spread from the introduction to be a step-by-step process of getting into the game and building your character. We take it 1 step at a time. Here you can see a list of all of our ancestries. That's what might be called races in a lot of games. We call them ancestries just because it lets us be a little bit more nuanced with what we do with them. So, for example, in our first edition, they were called races, and we had one called the Aasimar, which were like part angel. And by calling these ancestries and by mixing and matching them with different heritages, you could have a part angel who's a dwarf, or an elf, or a gnome, instead of a human, and it works a little bit better. And in our world, we've said that that's true, but the rules didn't sing to it before. And so we have these ancestries and all 12 classes in the game, from the bomb-lobbing alchemist all the way to the end to the spellbook reading, thesis writing wizard. And I have to say that if you played other editions of Pathfinder, you might know that wizards have like their schools of magic that they study. But we added new things to the game for each class, or for in a lot of the cases, a pretty big thing. And for the wizard, we added a thesis because we did a giant playtest of the game, and our fans were saying the wizard's strong, but it has a little something it needs thematically. And so we were thinking, the wizards they research magic, they're smart, they do it like a scientist in some ways. And so as the one who sort of joined the company from leaving graduate school, I said, well, what if they have to write a thesis to graduate? So we have the Wizard's thesis. Let me turn to that. Rogue Wizards at the end. Well, first of all, here's the Wizard opening page. It's gorgeous. And you've got Ezran, our iconic wizard. We have a named iconic character for each of the classes so that you can sort of get to know them and get to understand the classes and how to make them. And then we have our arcane thesis. So you've created a thesis, and then we have a special power you get for each thesis, but really those are thesis topics. Everyone's individual thesis is their own. You name your own thesis, and we gave an example which was based off theses that I have seen in real life. It is about like just changing around how you cast your spells. It's called On the Methods of Spell Interpolation and the Genesis of a New Understanding of the Building Blocks of Magic. Because, people write pompous theses like those all the time in real life. You may have had to endure a few of those yourself. So we added elements like that into the game for each class. Druids join orders. This they've never joined before. And this book is 640 pages. It's full of new contents. And we're just trying to make sure that the game is easier to pick up, but also just filled with options. So it has if you have played Pathfinder, awesome, go you. And we have the ability to tell all the stories that we could tell before in the first edition. That was one of our other big goals, in addition to lowering the barrier to entry. Tell the same stories. I'm converting one of our adventure paths called War for the Crown, which is a game about spies who are working to seat a particular claimant to a vacant throne in the game world. And I'm converting it from first to second edition, and it's taking me less time to convert the story to second edition than it would have to prepare it for first edition, because the game is so much easier to run. So if you have been playing first edition, we can tell the stories, and it is the mechanics are different. They're not the same. There is conversion that's needed. You can't just run it as it was, but it is so much simpler, so much easier to build your own things because of the modularity and the flexibility of it, and to make the game your own.
So you spoke to the step-by-step character creation, and it is easier mechanically to create characters now, but you've also woven in the thematic with the character creation. Can you speak to that choice and just how much easier it is to get new players into the thematic elements of the game?
Absolutely. So it's like I was saying before to you guys about how it's all about being able to tell your own story to build your character when you play Pathfinder. And the way we did that is in our previous game, you usually either roll dice to determine some of your starting stuff for your character, or do a point buy system that might be familiar for a lot of video games where you press the plus button and you raise up your ability score by a certain amount. In the new system, exactly like you said, we have built it so that you're telling the story of the character as you build the character. And you still get your ability, your strength or your intelligence up. But the way you do it is by learning. You learn a little bit more about your character as you go along, and they gain personality and depth. As you start, you pick your ancestry. Well, I was a dwarf. You have your background. Like many dwarves, I apprenticed as a blacksmith. Okay. And each of those steps gives you something about your character. A blacksmith could give you some strength from working at the forge, or some intelligence from being able to craft things, and intelligence is used for crafting. And one other ability score, because not all blacksmiths are the same. So maybe my blacksmith got charisma because I was dealing with customers. Charisma is sort of our personality and magnetism, and so you might need that for that. So after that, my class, maybe my dwarven blacksmith became a wizard and wanted to study something that was even more interesting than the blacksmith's puzzles that my master in blacksmithing had worked on for a while. That gives me something else. And by this point in the character, we've learned more about this character's motivations as we built up these ability scores, rather than just rolling them on dice or putting points into it like you normally would. So we really do want to engage the story and the imagination, the creativity, because the one place where tabletop games really have the advantage over video games is because obviously video games can calculate complex formulas like this. But in a tabletop game, you have a human who is running as the game master, and you have all of your fellow players, and you have the infinite ability to create your story, to do whatever you want, and the video game has to program that in, or else it's not there. For you, in a role-playing game, you can make it, and so that's why it's so important to us that we integrated those elements deeply into Pathfinder 2nd Edition.
I appreciate your time, Mark. If you guys want to know more about my first impressions on Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I also have an article going up soon about character creation step by step, tune into TechRaptor.net.